Before we dive into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now sit back and enjoy. Richard Stone, a millionaire CEO, found himself at yet another extravagant party. The room was filled with glamorous women, all vying for his attention, but he couldn't have been less interested. He was tired of the same dull conversations about expensive vacations and rare jewelry. Just as he was thinking of an excuse to leave, a sudden shout cut through the air. What the hell? All heads turned toward the entrance. A distinguished man in a pristine white suit, one of the city's most powerful bankers, stood frozen in shock, completely drenched in red juice. In front of him, a young woman in a delivery uniform clutched a bag from Oriental Flavor Restaurant, her face pale with horror. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you there," she stammered, frantically trying to dab his ruined suit with a napkin. The entire room burst into laughter. "Who let someone like her in here?" one woman sneered. "She's probably never even seen a suit up close." Layla's face burned with embarrassment. "I was just delivering an order," she explained. "The app must have sent me to the wrong address." The banker, still fuming, grumbled, "Get this girl out of here." Before Layla could react, a security guard grabbed her arm. "You don't belong here," he said coldly. She struggled. "Wait, I was just making a delivery. I didn't mean to trespass." "Let her go." The firm voice silenced the room. Everyone turned to see Richard Stone stepping forward. The security guard hesitated, releasing his grip. The guests exchanged stunned looks. Even the banker frowned. "Richard, don't tell me you're defending this girl," he scoffed. Ignoring him, Richard approached Layla, arms crossed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Layla," she replied hesitantly. "I do food deliveries for Oriental Flavor, but there was a mix-up with the address." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Wait, Oriental Flavor? Do they make yakisoba?" Layla blinked, confused. Yeah. How do you know?" For the first time that night, Richard smiled. "So you're the one who makes that amazing yakisoba?" Layla scratched her head. "Well, it's actually my grandmother's secret recipe. I just help cook it." Richard rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Perfect. I need a cook." Layla froze. The room collectively gasped. Even the banker looked dumbfounded. "Richard, you can't be serious," he exclaimed. Richard didn't care. "I'll pay you 3 times what you make as a delivery driver." Layla's breath caught. 3 times more? That was a fortune. But she couldn't just leave her grandmother alone at the restaurant. Thinking quickly, she folded her arms and blurted out, 5 times more. A stunned silence fell over the room. The banker nearly choked. The guests watched in shock. Richard raised an eyebrow. "You're pretty bold." "I've got bills to pay," she shot back. He chuckled. 4 times. 4.5. Richard smirked. "Do you always negotiate like this?" "Only when I'm in trouble." The whole room held its breath. Then, Richard extended his hand. "Deal." Layla's eyes widened. "What? You start tomorrow." The guests erupted in whispers and laughter. Layla looked at Richard, then at her stained apron, then back at the stunned crowd. What had just happened? She had only come to deliver food, and now she had a new job, working for an unpredictable billionaire CEO. What could possibly go wrong? The next morning, Layla woke up still trying to process everything. Had she really agreed to work for a billionaire? A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Layla, dear, breakfast is ready." She took a deep breath and stepped out of her room into the small kitchen of Oriental Flavor. Her grandmother, already up and working, was frying spring rolls for the day's first deliveries. "So," the older woman said without looking up, "how was that fancy party?" Layla grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down. "Oh, you know, I caused a disaster, spilled juice on a banker, almost got kicked out, and now I work for a billionaire CEO." Richard Stone. Her grandmother froze mid-motion, holding the spatula in the air. "What? I know, it sounds crazy," Layla said quickly, "but he offered me 5 times what I make here, and well, I accepted, but only part-time." Her grandmother went back to stirring the spring rolls, deep in thought. "And do you trust this man?" Layla shrugged. "He eats our yakisoba every week. If he were dangerous, He would have kidnapped me by now. The older woman chuckled, shaking her head. Well then, go ahead. But if he gives you trouble, let me know. I'll handle him. Layla quickly finished her coffee and stood up. Wish me luck that I don't break anything on my first day. The Stone Enterprises building was even more intimidating up close. As she stepped inside, she felt a blast of cold air from the AC and saw dozens of employees in suits and high heels rushing around, talking on their phones or typing on sleek, expensive tablets. She adjusted her apron, feeling completely out of place. A well-dressed receptionist glanced at her with a neutral expression. Can I help you? I'm Layla, Richard's new cook. The woman blinked slowly, as if trying to decide whether this was some kind of joke. After a brief silence, she picked up the phone and dialed quickly. Mr. Stone, your new cook is here. Layla heard a muffled response on the other end before the receptionist pointed toward the elevator. Top floor. Layla took a deep breath and stepped inside, her stomach twisting with nerves. When the doors opened, she found something completely different from what she had imagined. Richard's private kitchen wasn't just a kitchen, it was a masterpiece. Marble countertops, glass shelves, and a massive island in the center. And of course, Richard was there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, waiting for her. Took you long enough. I got lost 3 times on the way, but I made it. He chuckled, then gestured toward the ingredients on the counter. Good. Let's see if you actually know how to cook. You didn't test that before hiring me. No, that sounds like a bad business decision. It might be, but if it's terrible, I'll just fire you and move on. Layla narrowed her eyes. Was that a challenge? You can take it that way. She rolled up her sleeves. All right, let's see who loses here. Layla grabbed the ingredients and started cooking a simple yakisoba, just the way her grandmother had taught her. She could feel Richard watching her the entire time, which made her a little nervous. You're staring too much, she muttered as she stirred the vegetables. I'm studying the process. Can't tell if I'm a cook or an animal at the zoo. He smirked, just making sure my food will be edible. Layla rolled her eyes and focused, but soon a problem came up. She had been so caught up in the conversation that she added way too much soy sauce. The salty smell filled the air, and she felt a wave of panic. Oh no. What? Nothing. She tried to fix it quickly, but the damage was already done. Richard grabbed a plate, served himself a portion, and picked up a pair of chopsticks. He took a bite, chewed slowly, then frowned. Layla held her breath. Well, Richard looked at her and paused dramatically. Have you ever been to the ocean? Yes. Why? Because this has about the same amount of salt. Layla groaned. Great. First day, and I already ruined everything. Richard set the chopsticks down. It's a rookie mistake. But honestly, it's still better than a lot of things I've eaten. Layla crossed her arms. So that means I passed the test. He laughed. Yes, but with one condition. Don't poison you. No promises. A short time later, as Layla was cleaning the counter, someone walked into the kitchen without knocking. A man in a suit with a stern expression. Mr. Stone, can we talk? Richard sighed. Layla, finish up here and meet me in my office. She nodded and watched them leave. Alone in the kitchen, she started wondering what had just happened. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from a normal life to working at Stone Enterprises, cooking for a wealthy and arrogant businessman, and negotiating her salary like a seasoned professional. And now, she had a feeling this was just the beginning. Layla finished cleaning the kitchen and looked around. The place was spotless, and she felt a small sense of pride. If someone had told her a day ago that she'd be cooking in a billionaire's office, she would have laughed. But now she was here, drying her hands on her apron. She walked down the long hallway toward Richard's office. When she arrived, she stopped in front of the slightly open door. Inside, Richard was leaning against his desk, arms crossed, while the man in the suit spoke in a serious tone. This is not the right time for distractions, Richard. You need to stay focused on the merger with Sterling Group. You can't afford to waste time hiring street cooks. Layla narrowed her eyes. Street cook? She pushed the door open and stepped inside without hesitation. If I'm a street cook, then you're just an office executive. Same thing. The man turned to her, surprised by the interruption. And you are your boss's personal chef. Richard hid a smile. Layla, this is Paul, my financial advisor. Layla looked him up and down. Paul, huh? Nice. Now you can stop calling me a street cook. Paul scoffed and turned back to Richard. Are you really taking this seriously? Richard shrugged. Her food is better than any five-star restaurant around here. Layla lifted her chin. Paul crossed his arms. Fine. Then why don't you introduce this chef to your business partners? Let's see if she's really as good as you claim. Layla blinked. What? Richard considered the idea. You know, that's not a bad suggestion. Layla's eyes widened. Wait, what? Paul smirked. Tomorrow night, Richard has a business dinner. Why don't you cook for the investors? If you're as good as he says, everyone will be impressed. If not, I still get paid either way. Layla interrupted. Richard laughed. She's got a point. Paul narrowed his eyes. Then it's settled. Layla crossed her arms. And do I get to choose the menu? Paul hesitated. Well, usually these dinners have more sophisticated dishes. I was hired because my food is good, not because I follow rules. Richard looked at Paul. I like that. Paul sighed. Just don't make anyone sick. No promises, Layla replied with a smile. Lila glanced across the room and smiled. I told you. Layla blinked, surprised. She hadn't just impressed those people, she had won. And for the first time, she realized this new job might be far more interesting than she had expected. The success of the business dinner was still on her mind as she arrived at Stone Enterprises the next day. Investors had reacted with a mix of surprise and delight, proof that even simple food could win people over. But now, it seemed the company's employees had taken notice of her too. As she stepped into the building, she felt several eyes on her. Whispers filled the hallways. So this is the mysterious cook. How did someone like her get in here? I heard Mr. Stone is interested in her. Layla's eyes widened. Interested? What a ridiculous idea. She quickened her pace, tightening her grip on the shopping bag she carried. She needed to focus on work, not gossip. As soon as she stepped into Richard's private kitchen, something caught her attention. The countertops were covered with takeout boxes from high-end restaurants. Elegant, carefully plated dishes filled the table. But Richard, standing by the counter with a fork in his hand, looked like he was being forced to eat sand. Layla set her bag down and crossed her arms. What's going on here? Richard sighed, dropping the fork. Paul insisted I try food from some of the best chefs in town to refine my palate. Layla picked up one of the box lids and read the restaurant's name. LeBlanc. Oh, right. The place that charges $500 for a dish that looks like table decor. She glanced at the plates and frowned. This doesn't look like food. It looks like modern art. Richard chuckled. Finally, someone who agrees with me. She picked up a fork and stabbed a piece of meat, delicately decorated with gold leaf. She tasted it and immediately made a face. This tastes like seasoned cardboard. Richard laughed. Exactly. Layla looked at him, then at the luxurious food spread before them. You already had good food here, and you wasted all this just to try gourmet dishes. Blame Paul. He wants me to refine my taste. Layla rolled her eyes and started unpacking the bag she had brought. Well, if it's refined taste he wants, I'll show him what real food is. Richard watched as she began preparing a plate of fried rice with chicken and a special sauce. You're cooking just to prove a point, aren't you? He asked. She smiled. Always. Soon, the kitchen filled with the mouth-watering aroma of fresh food. Richard, still seated at the counter, observed closely as Layla finished the dish. When she placed a bowl in front of him, he didn't hesitate. He picked up the chopsticks, took the first bite, closed his eyes, and sighed. This is good. Layla crossed her arms, satisfied. Better than the expensive dishes. Richard smiled playfully. No comparison. Before Layla could respond, the kitchen door opened, and a blonde woman in a tailored suit walked in like she owned the place. "Richard, darling, I've been looking for you." She stopped when she noticed Layla and raised an eyebrow. "Who is this?" Richard, without even looking up from his food, said, "Layla, my personal chef." The blonde woman laughed dramatically. "A chef? What do you mean? You've never needed a chef." Layla noticed the way the woman looked at her, the typical glance of someone trying to decide if she belonged. "Well, now he does," Layla replied with a sly smile. The blonde seemed surprised by her boldness. Richard sighed and pushed his plate aside. "Layla, this is Miranda. Your ex-girlfriend?" Layla guessed. Miranda laughed again. "Oh dear, I'm still very much a part of Richard's life." Layla narrowed her eyes. "Lucky you." Richard rubbed his temple, clearly exhausted. "Miranda, what do you want?" She smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dinner tonight at LeBlanc, just like old times." Layla bit her lip to keep from laughing. Richard sighed. "I have a meeting." "Then tomorrow," Miranda insisted. He looked at Layla, then back at Miranda, and sighed again. "I have my own chef now. I don't need to go out to eat." Miranda's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered. "Well, I hope your new chef is very talented because I doubt anything can top dinner at LeBlanc." Layla leaned on the counter. "If you'd like, I can prepare something special for you." Miranda looked her up and down. "Oh dear, I doubt you're capable of that." Layla smiled sweetly. "There's only one way to find out." Richard hid a smirk as Miranda shot him a sharp look. "See you later, Richard." With that, she strutted out, leaving behind a strong scent of expensive perfume. Layla turned to Richard. "Has she always been like this?" "Worse." "Then good luck." Richard chuckled and went back to his meal. "Thanks. I'll need it." Layla sipped her juice, leaning against the counter as she watched him eat. She still didn't fully understand him. He was a billionaire, surrounded by opportunistic people, living in a world completely different from hers. But somehow he seemed normal. And that was a problem, because the more normal he seemed, the more she felt the need to keep her guard up. This was just a job, or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. The next morning, Layla arrived at Richard's office, feeling strangely at ease. In just a few days, she had adapted to the peculiar routine of cooking for an eccentric billionaire and dealing with the wary looks of the staff. What she didn't expect was to walk in on Richard and Paul in the middle of a heated argument. "This is ridiculous, Richard," Paul exclaimed, slamming his hand on the desk. Richard smirked, crossing his arms. "Sounds like a great challenge to me." Layla stopped at the doorway, holding a bag of fresh ingredients. "Am I interrupting something important?" Paul sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, clearly frustrated. "Tell him yourself that this idea is ridiculous." Layla frowned and looked at Richard. "What is it now?" Richard pointed to an open newspaper on the desk. The headline highlighted a charity food event featuring some of the city's top chefs. "Paul thinks I'm not capable of winning this cooking competition." Layla blinked. "You want to participate?" Richard gave a small smile. "Why not?" Paul rolled his eyes. "Because you're a CEO, not a chef." Layla crossed her arms. "Richard, can you at least cook an egg?" He tilted his head. "I made instant noodles once." Paul threw his hands up in exasperation. Leah watched in exasperation, knowing Richard didn't stand a chance. She bit her lip to keep from laughing. "Well then, I suggest he gets a good teacher." Richard looked at her with curiosity. "Are you offering to teach me?" She shrugged. "If you promise not to burn down the kitchen." The next few days were absolute chaos. Lila quickly realized that Richard Stone, the man responsible for billions of dollars in investments, was a complete disaster in the kitchen. On his first attempt at cooking a steak, he nearly set the pan on fire. "Why is there so much smoke?" he coughed, waving a hand in the air. "Because you turned the heat up too high," Leah exclaimed, grabbing the pan before it got worse. On his second attempt, he tried chopping onions and ended up cutting his own finger. "Ouch! My God, you're a danger to yourself." For the third lesson, Lila decided to keep it simple, a sandwich. But somehow, even that went wrong. You can't use half a jar of mayonnaise, Richard. But I like mayonnaise. Paul, who occasionally checked in on their progress, always left shaking his head. This is going to be a disaster. But Lila refused to give up. He might be a disaster now, but he'll get better. Richard raised an eyebrow. You have that much faith in me? She smirked. No, but I like a challenge. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. The hall buzzed with excitement, filled with renowned chefs, influential business people, and eager press covering every detail. The judges were ready to taste the competitors' dishes. Richard wore a spotless apron. Despite his lack of experience, he seemed surprisingly confident. Lila stayed behind the scenes, watching with a mix of apprehension and pride. The competition began. Participants had 1 hour to prepare an original dish. Richard grabbed his ingredients with determination and started cooking. Lila held her breath. Was he still a disaster? Yes, but over the past few days, he had improved. She watched as he chopped vegetables, still slow, but at least he wasn't cutting himself. He prepared the sauce with focus, no wasted ingredients. And when he plated the dish, he did it with precision, without drowning it in mayonnaise. When time was up, the judges began tasting. Lila bit her lip nervously. One judge took a bite, then another. The third followed. The room fell silent. Then, one of the judges wiped his mouth and looked at Richard. Mr. Stone, I have to admit, the suspense was unbearable. This is surprisingly delicious. Lila let out a relieved breath. Paul, watching from a distance, widened his eyes. But how? The second judge nodded in agreement. The balance of flavors, the texture, truly impressive. Richard gave a small smile and glanced at Lila, who responded with a thumbs up. When the final results were announced, Richard didn't win, but he placed second. For a CEO who had never cooked before, that was a victory. As the event wrapped up, Richard approached Lila with a satisfied smile. So, teacher, did I do a good job? She grinned. I'd say you passed with flying colors. He stepped closer, looking thoughtful. There's something I've been meaning to ask. Lila crossed her arms. What is it? Richard tilted his head. How about we open a restaurant together? Lila blinked. What? He smiled. I'm serious. Your food is amazing, and honestly, I'm starting to enjoy this. She studied him, trying to see if he was joking, but from the gleam in his eyes, she realized he wasn't. And for the first time, she started to wonder, maybe this wasn't just the end of a challenge. Maybe it was the beginning of something much bigger. After the competition, Lila thought life would go back to normal. But ever since Richard suggested opening a restaurant, her mind wouldn't stop racing. A billionaire as her business partner? It sounded like a joke. But when she arrived at the office the next morning, she realized Richard wasn't kidding. Right in the middle of the massive conference table sat a stack of documents. Good morning, cooking teacher. Richard greeted her with a sly smile. Lila narrowed her eyes at the papers. What's this? He crossed his arms. Potential locations for the restaurant. She blinked. Wait, you actually want to open a restaurant with me? He pulled out a chair and tapped the papers lightly. Not only do I want to, but I've already started looking for the best places. She let out a nervous laugh. Richard, this is crazy. I'm just a cook who learned from my grandmother. He shrugged. And I'm just a billionaire who never cooked in his life and almost set the kitchen on fire trying to fry a steak. Sounds like a good balance. Lila shook her head. You really have no idea what you're doing, do you? Richard smirked. I just know that every great investment starts with a good plan, and I have one. She sighed, pulling up a chair. Okay, suppose I agree to this crazy idea. Where do you plan to open it? He opened a document, pointing at locations. I have 3 options, one downtown, another in an upscale neighborhood, and a third near your village. Lila froze. Near my village? Richard nodded. I thought it'd be a great way to support your community. And honestly, homemade food has a strong appeal. She studied him suspiciously. Was this your idea or Paul's? Richard chuckled. Mine. Paul thinks it's a mistake to invest outside the commercial center, but I disagree. Lila bit her lip. Is this serious? 100%. She was quiet for a moment, trying to process everything. It was an incredible opportunity, but also a huge risk. Richard noticed her hesitation and leaned forward. "What's holding you back?" "My grandmother. I don't want to leave her alone in the restaurant." Richard tilted his head. "Then bring her to the new one." Lila's eyes widened. "You make it sound so simple." "Isn't it? She's a great cook. You are too. It would be a family business." Lila was speechless. Richard smiled. "Come on, Lila. What do you have to lose?" She took a deep breath. "Fine, but I want half the decision-making power." "Deal. And no outrageous prices. I want it to be affordable for everyone." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You really know how to negotiate." Lila grinned. "I learned from you." The first thing she did after leaving the office was rush home to tell her grandmother. She found the old woman folding aprons in the small kitchen of Sabor Oriental. "Grandma, you won't believe this." The woman looked up with a warm smile. "What is it, Lila?" "Richard wants to open a restaurant with me." Her grandmother blinked in surprise. "The billionaire you work for?" "Yes, and he wants to open it near the village." The old woman simply smiled and kept folding. "And do you want this?" Lila hesitated. "I think so, but only if you come with me." Her grandmother chuckled. "My dear, I'm too old for that. But it's time for you to build your own story." For the first time, Lila realized maybe she was ready. Lila folded her arms, glaring. "We need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you." She shot back. Miranda strolled in uninvited, her eyes scanning the space with obvious disdain. "So this is where you work? Figures." Lila sighed. "What do you want, Miranda?" The blonde smirked, stepping closer. "Just a little friendly warning." Lila raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Miranda flicked her hair and sighed dramatically. "You might think Richard is being generous, but men like him never do anything without a reason." Lila clenched her fists. "And what exactly are you trying to say?" Miranda shrugged. "Just that when he gets bored with this little game, he'll toss you aside." Lila's blood boiled. "Funny, because it looks like he got tired of you first." Miranda's face turned red. "Let's see how long you last, sweetheart." With that, she turned and walked out. Lila felt her chest tighten. She didn't want to believe a word Miranda said, but what if she was right? Richard was a billionaire. She was just a cook. Was this all just a passing whim for him? The next day, Lila marched into Richard's office, determined to talk. But before she could say anything, he was already signing papers. "Done. We're officially partners now." Lila swallowed hard. There was no turning back. This was either going to be the best decision of her life, or the worst. After signing the contract, she was now co-owner of a restaurant with a billionaire. It sounded absurd, but the real work was just beginning. Richard, with all his business experience, wanted everything to be perfect. "We need a strong brand identity," he said, clicking through logo designs on his computer. Sitting across from him, Lila groaned and rubbed her face. "Richard, this is a restaurant, not a tech company." He tilted his head. "Branding is important." She rolled her eyes. "Not more important than the food." Richard smirked. Okay, let's focus on the food then." Just as she relaxed, Paul walked in, a stack of papers in hand. "We've got a problem." Lila closed her eyes for a second. "Of course we do." Richard took the papers. "What now?" Paul sighed. "The property we chose needs major repairs. More than we expected." Lila's eyes widened. "Like what?" "Electrical issues, leaks, and let's just say there's a pigeon's nest inside the kitchen." She groaned, holding her head. "This cannot be happening." Richard flipped through the documents. "We can fix it. It'll take some time, but nothing impossible." Paul crossed his arms. "Only problem? It's going to be expensive." Lila narrowed her eyes. "How expensive?" Paul hesitated. Richard, however, seemed completely unfazed. "Don't worry about it." Lila slammed her hand on the table. "Don't worry? Richard, this isn't just your money. I'm your partner. I need to know." Richard studied her for a moment, then scribbled a number on a piece of paper and slid it over. Lila looked at the number and nearly fell out of her chair. Are you out of your mind? Richard shrugged. It's a necessary investment. Richard, with that amount, I could buy half the town. Paul, clearly enjoying the exchange, just watched. Lila took a deep breath. What if we find another location? Richard shook his head. This is the right place. Then he crossed his arms. Do you trust me? Lila froze. He asked it so seriously. She sighed. Fine, but if this restaurant fails, I'll haunt you forever. Richard laughed. Fair enough. The restaurant quickly turned into a construction zone. Lila spent her days overseeing every detail. And Richard, well, he tried to help. Richard, no. That paint is for the walls, not the counter. Are you sure? I think it would add a modern touch. Paul, sipping his coffee from afar, chuckled. I should really start recording this. Richard threw a paintbrush at him. Days passed, and finally, the restaurant began to take shape. When Lila stepped inside the finished space for the first time, her heart skipped a beat. It's real, she whispered. Richard smiled. And this is just the beginning. The next challenge, hiring a team. Lila wanted locals, people who understood the heart of homemade food. Richard insisted on a top-tier chef. Lila, we need someone experienced. I have experience. Someone with credentials. She put her hands on her hips. Oh, sure, because the diploma teaches what my grandmother's been doing for 50 years. Richard sighed. That's not what I meant. Lila crossed her arms. Then let me build my own team. He raised an eyebrow. You that confident? She smirked. I'll prove I'm right. Lila went straight to her village. Mr. Pedro, do you still make those amazing beans? Mrs. Rosa, looking for a job. Within days, her team was ready. When Richard saw them, all scratching their heads at how a billionaire and a village cook became business partners, he just smiled. Lila nudged him. Bet you've never worked with such good people. He chuckled. We'll see if they can handle it. Opening day arrived faster than Lila expected. The whole town was buzzing. Journalists were outside, customers lined up, and inside? Pure chaos. The sauce is off. The rice is burnt. Who put sugar in the soy sauce? Richard strolled into the kitchen, arms crossed. What's going on? Lila ran a hand over her face. Chaos. That's what's happening. He laughed. Breathe. It's all under control. How can you be so calm? Richard grabbed her shoulders. Because you're the best cook I know. She froze, momentarily forgetting everything. Order up. And just like that, the opening began. Customers loved the food. Compliments flooded in. Lila could hardly believe it. Paul smirked at Richard. You took a big risk. Richard watched Lila laughing as she served a table. And it paid off. Paul chuckled. It's not just about the restaurant, is it? Richard looked away. I don't know what you're talking about. Paul laughed. Sure you don't. Days later, the restaurant was still packed. But with success came exhaustion. I'm dying. Lila groaned, collapsing into a chair. Richard, sipping coffee, chuckled. You wanted this, remember? I wanted a restaurant, not to become a zombie. He shrugged. Easy fix. How? I hired more staff. The kitchen door swung open, revealing 3 new employees. Lila blinked. Who are you? Richard grinned. Our new team. She put her hands on her hips. Richard, I'm your partner. You can't just hire people without telling me. He shrugged. You were tired. I solved the problem. Lila opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. He had a point. Fine. You win this one. He smirked. As always. She rolled her eyes. Don't get used to it. With the restaurant thriving, everything seemed to be falling into place. But then, one day, Miranda walked back into their lives. She strolled into the restaurant like she owned the place, wearing sunglasses and high heels. Good morning, darlings, she announced. Lila's stomach twisted. Richard, who was at the register, frowned. What do you want, Miranda? She flashed a smug smile. Just came to see how you guys are doing after all the success. Lila crossed her arms. You never show up without a reason. Miranda sighed dramatically. Well, since you mentioned it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a golden invitation. I'm organizing a special event and would love for you to handle the catering. Lila blinked. What? Miranda kept smiling. I know we've had our differences, but business is business, right? Lila glanced at Richard, who looked suspicious. And what kind of event is this? He asked. A charity dinner, Miranda said smoothly. A lot of important people will be there. It could be a huge opportunity for you. Lila hesitated. Despite everything, it wasn't a bad idea. But could she trust Miranda? She turned to Richard. What do you think? He exhaled. I think trusting her is risky. Miranda rolled her eyes. For God's sake, Richard, I'm offering you a golden opportunity. Lila hesitated a bit more, but finally said, Okay, we'll do the catering. Miranda grinned in triumph. Great. Richard folded his arms. If you try anything. Relax, darling, Miranda cut in. It's going to be a success. And with that, she walked out. Richard turned to Lila. Are you sure about this? She took a deep breath. I know she has an agenda, but if this helps the restaurant grow, it's worth the risk. Richard sighed. You're braver than I thought. Lila smirked. You haven't seen anything yet. Over the next few days, Lila and her team worked tirelessly to prepare for Miranda's event, but something felt off. On the day of the event, as they arrived to set up the buffet, Lila noticed unsettling signs. The waiters seemed nervous, and the organizers avoided eye contact. Then, Richard's phone rang. He answered, and his face immediately went pale. What? Lila turned to him. What's going on? Richard looked at her, his eyes dark with anger. Miranda set us up. Lila's heart pounded. What do you mean? He took a deep breath. She told all the guests that the food was made by another chef. Lila's eyes widened. What? Basically, she's using our food but giving credit to a competitor. Lila clenched her fists. That snake. Richard turned to the staff. Everyone stop serving. Now. The waiters exchanged nervous glances, but Lila wasn't about to let this slide. Without a second thought, she marched up to the stage, grabbed a microphone, and spoke loud and clear. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the dinner. I just want to clarify something. Miranda, standing at the back of the room, went pale. All of this food, Lila continued, was prepared by Sabor Delilah, by me and my team. A murmur spread through the crowd as guests exchanged surprised looks. Miranda stepped forward. This is a mistake. But Lila wasn't finished. If anyone has doubts, come to the kitchen. I'll cook a dish for you right here. The room erupted in applause. Miranda trembled with rage, while Richard simply smiled. This girl is amazing. That night, Lila and Richard left the event victorious. Miranda had tried to pull one over on them, but she was the one who ended up looking foolish. For the first time, Lila realized she and Richard made a great team. After the fiasco at Miranda's event, the name Sabor Delilah was everywhere, newspapers, social media, and word of mouth. Lila couldn't walk through the city without being recognized. Hey, it's the chef from Sabor Delilah, a woman in the market pointed. You have to teach me that recipe. Another customer gushed. Lila, carrying a bag full of ingredients, gave a nervous smile and hurried away. Richard, walking beside her with his hands in his pockets, smirked. You're getting famous. I didn't want to get famous, Lila muttered, tossing a tomato into her bag. But it's too late now. Richard chuckled. This is your fault. He raised an eyebrow. My, Lila pointed at him. You dragged me into this world of rich people, and now I'm stuck. He laughed. Did I drag you? Or did you come willingly? She opened her mouth to argue, but shut it. Deep down, she knew he was right. With the restaurant booming, Richard decided it was time to take things further. I want you to cook for a special dinner. Lila frowned. What do you mean by special? He grinned. A business dinner. Just a few select people. Lila blinked. So more rich people. Basically. She sighed. I don't know if my heart can take this. Richard laughed. You'll be fine. The dinner was held on the top floor of a luxury hotel. When Lila arrived carrying fresh ingredients, she immediately felt out of place. "I definitely don't belong in this world," she muttered. But the moment she stepped into the kitchen, everything changed. That was where she felt at home. Lila felt truly in her element while cooking, and in the meantime, Richard kept the guests entertained. The business executives were thoroughly impressed with how much the restaurant had grown. "You've really discovered hidden gem, Richard," one of them remarked. "That girl has real talent," another added. Richard simply smiled. "I know." As the dishes were served, the room fell into silence. The first to break, it was an older gentleman with gray hair. "This is incredible," he said, his voice full of admiration. The others nodded in agreement. Watching from a distance, Lila felt warmth spread in her chest. She had done it, but not everything went as smoothly as planned. When Lila returned to the kitchen, she noticed something that shouldn't have been there. "What are you doing?" she demanded. A waiter was holding a suspicious bottle and was about to pour something into the sauce. Lila rushed over and stopped him immediately. His eyes widened in panic before he bolted out of the kitchen. "Come back here," she shouted, but he was already gone. Lila looked down at the bottle in her hands and shivered. Someone had tried to sabotage the dinner. She ran straight to Richard. "We need to talk." Richard immediately noticed the urgency in her voice. "What happened?" She showed him the bottle. "Someone tried to put this in the sauce." Richard's expression darkened. "Who?" Lila sighed. "I didn't see clearly, but he ran the second he saw me." Richard took a deep breath. "I'll handle it." For the first time, Lila saw something new in his eyes, pure fury. The dinner ended well, but Richard couldn't relax. He needed to find out who was behind the sabotage. Meanwhile, Lila was completely drained. "I just want to sleep for a week," she mumbled. Richard watched her for a moment, then, without thinking, placed his hand over hers. "You did an amazing job today." She blushed. "Thank you." He smiled. "And now, I think we deserve a break." Lila laughed. "Finally, something sensible coming from you." The next morning, the restaurant felt different. Lila arrived early, still haunted by what had happened the night before. Someone had tried to ruin their reputation. If she hadn't caught it in time, everything she and Richard had built could have collapsed. "This can never happen again," she muttered to herself. She walked into the kitchen and started organizing the ingredients, but before she could get to work, Richard appeared. "We need to talk," he said. Lila sighed. "If this is about last night, I'm already stressed enough." Richard crossed his arms. "I know, but this is serious." Lila frowned. "What is it?" Richard pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward her. Lila's stomach dropped. "What is this?" A shocking headline flashed on the screen. "Successful restaurant owner caught in fraud scandal. Rumors suggest head chef is a fraud. ****. Lila's face was in the article. Her eyes widened. "Who wrote this?" Richard sighed. "I'm looking into it, but someone is trying to destroy us." Lila clenched her fists. "This is insane. I work harder than anyone here. How can they say I'm a fraud?" Richard exhaled. "I'll fix this." "How?" she asked. His gaze was firm. "By giving them exactly what they want." Lila blinked. "Are you crazy?" Richard smirked. "Trust me." Lila crossed her arms. "Fine, but if this backfires, you're washing all the dishes for a month." Richard grinned. "Deal." Over the next few days, Richard did the unthinkable. He announced a live cooking event. Anyone could come and watch Lila cook in real time. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, nerves creeping in. Richard nodded. "If they doubt your skills, we'll prove them wrong." Lila bit her lip. This could go terribly wrong. Richard chuckled. Or it could go incredibly right. The event day arrived, and the restaurant was packed. Journalists, influencers, loyal customers, and skeptics had all come to see if Lila was truly talented or just a fraud. Lila took a deep breath, and Richard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just do what you always do." She nodded and stepped into the kitchen. What followed was pure magic. Lila cooked with passion, effortlessly creating exquisite flavors. Every dish was flawless. By the end of the event, every journalist was raving about her talent. "She's incredible. The food is amazing. She's definitely no fraud. Richard, watching from the sidelines, smiled. Told you. Lila, completely drained, sat down. That was the most terrifying thing I've ever done. Richard laughed. But it was worth it. She smiled. Yeah, it really was. After the event, Lila became a local sensation. Sabor de Lila was constantly packed, and her name was everywhere. But she knew success wasn't always smooth sailing. This is all moving too fast, she admitted to Richard one evening. He leaned against the counter. And isn't that a good thing? Lila sighed. It is, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad is coming. Richard chuckled. You're being paranoid. Maybe, she admitted. But ever since that sabotage attempt, I haven't been able to relax. Richard's expression grew serious. If someone's still after us, I'll find out who. That night, Richard met with Samuel Lopez, a private investigator. I need to know who's behind this, Richard said. Samuel raised an eyebrow. And why do you care so much? Richard hesitated, then admitted, because this affects me too. 2 days later, Samuel called. I found your culprit. Richard answered immediately. Who is it? Miranda. Richard clenched his jaw. Of course, it's her. She's planning something bigger, Samuel warned. What? Samuel sighed. She's trying to buy the restaurant. Richard smiled. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. But deep down, he knew Miranda wouldn't give up so easily. The next morning, Lila received an outrageous proposal. A man in a suit arrived at the restaurant, handing her a contract. Miss Miranda wants to purchase this restaurant for a generous price. Lila took the paper and glanced at the numbers. Is she kidding me? The man adjusted his glasses. No, Mississippi. She believes this is a fair offer. Lila tore up the contract. Tell her I'm not for sale. The man hesitated for a moment, then silently picked up the pieces and left. Shortly after, Richard walked in. What did he want? He asked. Lila crossed her arms. Miranda tried to buy me out. Richard smirked. And what did you do? Lila lifted her chin. What do you think? He chuckled. You surprise me more every day. But Miranda wasn't done. The next day, shocking news spread like wildfire. Sabor de Lila was shut down due to sanitary violations. Lila's heart sank. This can't be real. Richard immediately suspected foul play. She wants the restaurant closed. Lila refused to back down. Then we fight. Richard grinned. Now you're speaking my language. The news hit like a bomb. Lila stared at the headline. Sabor de Lila closed due to sanitary violations. She threw her phone onto the table. This is ridiculous. Richard, standing beside her, examined the official documents. This is a setup. Miranda must have bribed someone. Lila's anger boiled over. She wants to destroy everything we've built. Richard crossed his arms, deep in thought. If she wants a war, then she'll get one. The next morning, Lila and Richard stormed into the health inspection office. A man in a gray suit greeted them with a monotone expression. Miss Lila, Mr. Stone, I'm sorry to inform you, but Sabor de Lila is closed until further notice. Lila leaned over the desk, furious. Based on what? The man flipped through a report. Expired products, unsanitary kitchen conditions, and a pest infestation. That's a lie. Lila slammed her hand on the table. Richard stayed calm. We want to see the evidence. The inspector sighed and slid some photos toward them. Lila picked them up and felt sick. Shelves lined with expired products, pots covered in grime, and worst of all, a cockroach in the pantry. This can't be, she whispered. Richard studied the photos. Then his eyes locked onto something. These images are fake. The inspector raised an eyebrow. How can you be sure? Richard pointed to a detail in one of the photos. This brand of seasoning hasn't been on the market for 2 years. The inspector hesitated. Lila stood up. This proves someone planted the evidence to frame us. The man sighed. Still, the complaint has been filed. If you want to reverse the decision, you'll need a new inspection. Then do one now, Lila demanded. The inspector shook his head. There's a bureaucratic process. A new inspection won't happen for another 2 weeks. Lila's eyes widened. 2 weeks. Richard clenched his fists. This isn't a coincidence. Miranda is pulling the strings. Lila felt a lump in her throat. 2 weeks of closure meant financial loss, lost customers, and worst of all, damage to the restaurant's reputation. Then an idea struck her. She turned to Richard. If we can't open the restaurant, then let's bring the restaurant to the customers. The next morning, Lila and Richard worked in the kitchen, preparing special takeout meals. If people can't come to us, we'll bring the food to them, Lila said. Richard grinned. I like the way you think. Within hours, the restaurant team set up an improvised delivery system. Let's post this on social media, Lila said, grabbing her phone. Richard quickly typed, Suborder Lila may be closed, but our food still comes to you. Order now and enjoy homemade flavors wherever you are. Asterisk asterisk. Customers went wild. Do you think this will work? Lila asked anxiously. Richard smirked. Do you doubt me? Always. Then you're going to be surprised. And it worked. Orders poured in. The kitchen turned into a frenzy of activity, packing meals, organizing deliveries, making sure everything was perfect. We're overwhelmed, an employee exclaimed. Lila laughed. Is that a problem or a solution? Despite the chaos, the plan was working. But Miranda wasn't done. That night, a new headline appeared. Closed restaurant continues to operate illegally. Lila held her phone, seething. This woman has no limits. Richard took her phone. Let me handle this. He called Samuel, a private investigator. Find out how Miranda is getting this information and let me know. Lila crossed her arms. She has a mole. Richard nodded. And we'll find out who. The next morning, they caught him. One of their employees taking secret photos. Lila stormed out of the kitchen. What are you doing? The man swallowed hard, hiding his phone. Richard grabbed it and saw messages exchanged with Miranda. Gotcha. The employee tried to run, but Richard blocked him. Speak now, or we take this to the police. The man hesitated, then confessed. Miranda paid me to pass on information. She wanted to know what you were doing and sabotage your plans. Lila clenched her fists, trying to contain her fury. Richard stared at the man. Grab your things and get out. The man ran off. Lila turned to Richard. This means Miranda knows we're fighting back. Richard nodded. And now that we know the truth, it's time to strike back. He picked up his phone. Hey, I need a favor. Samuel's voice came through. What do you have in mind? Richard smiled. It's time to expose Miranda. The next day, a bombshell article appeared online. Businesswoman caught in sabotage scheme against rival restaurant. The article contained damning evidence, messages, bank transactions, bribes. Miranda was exposed. By the end of the day, Lila and Richard were called to a meeting with the regulatory agency. With this new information, we will reopen Sabor de Lila immediately, the inspector announced. Lila's eyes filled with tears. Really? The inspector smiled. Really? She turned to Richard and hugged him tightly. He was surprised but hugged her back. We did it. That night, the restaurant reopened with a line of eager customers stretching down the sidewalk. Lila smiled. This is unbelievable. Richard put his hands in his pockets. No, this is the result of your hard work. She looked at him. He looked back. Silence. Then Lila chuckled. If you think this means you eat for free, you're wrong. Richard laughed. You really are impossible. But deep down, he knew. He was completely smitten with her. With a smile on her face for the first time in weeks, Lila finally felt like she was in control. Now, let's have some fun. If you're someone who only reads the comments, type Pepsi below. Only those who made it this far will get it. All right, back to the story. Richard, on the other hand, observed everything from a distance. His expression puzzled the staff. He's acting weird, one of the cooks muttered. Maybe he's in love with the boss. Another joked, laughing. Or maybe he's just up to something. Someone else chimed in. And indeed he was. That night, Richard waited until all the customers had left and the staff had finished their work before approaching Lila. She was in the kitchen, wiping down a counter when she sensed someone behind her. I need to talk to you. Lila turned and raised an eyebrow. If this is about a new investment, can I decline now or later? Richard chuckled, crossing his arms. This time, it's not about business. She dried her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. So what is it? He took a deep breath. I want to take you out to dinner. She blinked. Dinner? Like outside the restaurant? Yes. Lila tilted her head, suspicious. You've never invited me to dinner before. There's always a first time. She studied him, trying to figure out his angle, but something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, told her this wasn't just about dinner. After a deep breath, she surprised herself by saying, Okay. The restaurant they chose was one of the most luxurious in the city. Lila looked around, feeling out of place. I feel like I'm being judged. Richard smiled. You are, but just ignore it. She rolled her eyes. Easy for you to say. You were born into this world. He tilted his head. Where would you rather be? Lila thought for a moment. Somewhere I can be myself. Where no one cares if my clothes have flour on them or if my hands smell like spices. Richard was quiet for a few seconds. You know, I like that about you. Lila felt her face warm. What? You don't try to fit in. You're not afraid to be yourself. She let out a nervous laugh. If that's a compliment, I'll make a note. They don't come often. Richard laughed, lifting his wine glass. Then you should take more notes. I have plenty more to give. Lila's heart pounded. Why was he saying these things? And more importantly, why did it make her feel things she shouldn't? The dinner went smoothly, too smoothly. They talked like nothing else in the world mattered. Like, in that moment, it was just them. But everything crashed when they stepped outside. Across the street, a group of journalists waited. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in their faces. Mr. Stone, is Miss Lila your new girlfriend? Was this a date? Are you no longer interested in high society women? Lila froze. Richard remained calm, but his expression turned cold. He wrapped an arm around her waist and quickly led her to the car. Just ignore them. But it was impossible to ignore. They were now the center of the city's attention, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the internet exploded. CEO Richard Stone spotted on a romantic dinner with village girl Lila. Lila nearly had a panic attack when she saw it. Messages flooded her phone, clients, friends, even strangers bombarding her. Is this true? Are you dating? When did this happen? She groaned, tossing her phone onto the table and running her hands over her face. This is a nightmare. And then the phone rang. Without thinking, she answered. Lila. Her stomach dropped. Grandma, I can explain. Are you seeing that man? No, I mean yes, but it's not like they're saying. Then what is it like? Lila had no answer, and at that moment, there was a knock on the door. She turned, and there stood Richard. Just when she thought the day couldn't get worse, he crossed his arms. Did you see the news? Lila sighed. Of course I did. My phone won't stop, and my grandma is ready to strangle me. I'm sorry. Sorry? This is ruining my reputation. He raised an eyebrow. Your reputation? Or your heart? Lila froze. What? Because I think you're more scared of what you feel than what people think. She was speechless. Richard took a step closer. I like you, Lila. And I think you like me too. Her world spun. Richard, you don't have to answer now. Just think about it. Lila had no idea what to think. All she knew was that her heart was a complete mess. That night, she couldn't sleep. She tossed, turned, stared at the ceiling. Nothing helped. She was lost. And worse, maybe she was in love. Lila stayed up all night. No matter how hard she tried to push the thoughts away, Richard was still on her mind. Every word he said, every look he gave, every moment he made her feel special. She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Lila had tried to convince herself it was all just a game, but deep down, she knew it was real. The worst part, she had enjoyed it. Admitting that, however, was too terrifying. The next morning, she threw herself into work, determined to keep her mind off Richard Stone and the way his intense gaze made her feel. She arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, ready to stay busy. But fate had other plans. As soon as she stepped into the kitchen, she noticed a white envelope sitting on the counter. Her name was handwritten on the front. Heart pounding, she picked it up and opened it. "Don't run away. We need to talk. I'll be waiting for you at the Grand Imperial Hotel at 7 p.m. Richard." A flutter of anticipation filled her stomach. He wanted to talk, but about what? And should she even go? The day flew by faster than she expected, and before she knew it, evening had arrived. Lila stood in front of her mirror, torn. Part of her wanted to ignore the note entirely. The other part already knew. She was going. At exactly 7 p.m., Lila arrived at the Grand Imperial Hotel. The luxurious atmosphere made her feel slightly out of place, but she pushed forward. Her eyes scanned the hall until they landed on Richard. He stood by a reserved table, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression serious, yet kind. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward him. "You came," he said. She sighed. "I still haven't decided if it was a mistake." Richard offered a faint smile. "Then sit down and find out." Rolling her eyes, she took a seat. The waiter poured 2 glasses of wine, and for the first time, Lila noticed something unusual. Richard looked nervous. That was rare. "What's wrong?" she asked. He took a sip of his wine before answering. "I want to make you an offer." Lila frowned. "If it's another job, I want you to be with me." The world seemed to freeze. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "What?" Richard met her gaze. "I like you, Lila, and I don't want to pretend I don't anymore." Her heart pounded. "Richard, this doesn't make sense." "It makes all the sense in the world. You affect me in a way no one else ever has. I don't care where you come from or what people say. I only care about what we have." Emotion swirled inside her. She wanted to believe him, to say yes, but fear held her back. "I'm not like the women you know," she whispered. Richard reached across the table, taking her hand. "I don't want you to change. I want you just the way you are." Tears burned in her eyes. "You can't promise that." "Then give me a chance to prove it." Silence stretched between them, her heart racing. The rest of the world faded away. Then, without thinking, she cupped his face and kissed him. A kiss filled with everything she had held back. And in that moment, everything made sense. The following days were a whirlwind. News of their relationship spread fast. Speculation, gossip, and critics surfaced, but none of it mattered. They were happy. For the first time in her life, Lila felt truly, deeply happy. Months later, Richard surprised her with a special dinner. It felt more significant than their usual dates. Then, as the clock struck midnight, he knelt before her, holding a velvet box. "Marry me." Lila's heart nearly stopped. "What?" Richard smiled. "I know this wasn't in your plans. I know marriage was never something you imagined for yourself. But I also know I can't imagine my life without you." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Richard, I love you, Lila, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." A laugh escaped her, half joy, half disbelief. Overwhelmed, she nodded through her tears. Yes, their wedding was nothing like the grand ceremonies of high society. Richard wanted something that felt like them, something real. So, they married in Lila's hometown, in the garden of her grandmother's house. The decorations were simple, twinkling lights hanging from the trees, wildflowers placed in handmade vases, and tables filled with homemade food prepared by the community. Lila wore a delicate lace dress, nothing extravagant, yet she looked like a princess. Her hair flowed naturally, adorned with tiny flowers. Richard, ever the composed businessman, wore a tailored suit, but without the usual formal stiffness. He wanted the day to be perfect for her. The entire village attended. Lila's grandmother cried tears of joy, and the locals cheered as the couple exchanged vows. It was simple, but filled with love. During the celebration, Lila noticed something unexpected. Richard was completely at ease. He laughed with the guests, balanced a plate full of yakisoba that she had made earlier that day, and looked nothing like the unreachable CEO the world knew him as. He was just a man, madly in love with his wife. Lila smiled, realizing how far they had come. She had never imagined her life turning out this way. But looking at Richard in the place where she grew up, she knew he belonged there, just as much as she did. Then, as they prepared to leave, Richard took her hand and whispered, "Now you're officially mine. Forever." She smirked. "I hope you can handle spending the rest of your life with the stubborn cook." He laughed, pulling her into another kiss. What do you think of Richard and Lila's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this love story? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications so you never miss another heartwarming tale.